Pelican Bay Exposed, America's Most Secure Prison, full documentary. Fortress of Fear. If you think you know what a maximum security prison looks like, think again. Subscribe now, because once you step inside Pelican Bay, you'll never see freedom the same way again. The edge of the world. Northern California. Crescent City. To outsiders, it's just a small coastal town surrounded by mist, redwood trees, and the roar of the Pacific Ocean. But for those who live there, one structure dominates everything. A massive slab of concrete carved into the wilderness, hidden behind fences, razor wire, and guard towers. Pelican Bay State Prison. Opened in 1989, Pelican Bay was designed as California's answer to a problem no other facility could handle. What to do with the worst of the worst. Murderers. Gang shot callers. Cartel lieutenants. Inmates who turned other prisons upside down. Here they were supposed to be silenced, contained, broken. And the weapon used to do it? The Security Housing Unit, the infamous SHU. Life in the SHU. The SHU is where Pelican Bay earns its reputation as America's most secure prison. It is a world of steel and silence. Prisoners are locked in small concrete cells for 22.5 hours a day. They see daylight only in a small exercise pen, known as the dog run, a concrete pit with a mesh ceiling where the sky is just a sliver above razor wire. Cells have no windows. Meals are pushed through slots. Inmates speak to each other by shouting through vents, by tapping codes on walls. Some men spend years, others spend decades, and some never leave at all. Psychologists call it segregated housing. Inmates call it living burial. The gangs inside. But Pelican Bay isn't just about isolation. It's also about control. Here, the most powerful prison gangs in America call the shots. The Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, their leaders or shot callers, were all locked in the SHU. From inside those cells, they directed criminal empires that stretched across the state and beyond. Drug pipelines, extortion rackets, even murders on the streets, all traced back to coded orders scratched on scraps of paper smuggled out of Pelican Bay. A guard once said, "Pelican Bay isn't just a prison. It's the boardroom of organized crime." And the SHU? That was the executive suite. The lawsuit. By the late 1990s, Pelican Bay's methods came under fire. Former inmates and human rights groups accused the prison of torture, of using solitary confinement not as punishment but as a permanent tool of control. In 1995, a federal judge ruled that conditions inside Pelican Bay violated the Eighth Amendment. Testimonies described beatings, psychological torment, and men driven to madness by years of isolation. But instead of shutting it down, the ruling forced changes that only scratched the surface. The SHU remained. The gangs remained. The violence remained. And the prison's reputation grew darker. Whispers from the inside. Detective Raymond Danner, who had seen riots, murders, and corruption in Pelican Bay before, once called it a factory of violence. You think you're locking it down, but you're just compressing it until it explodes. And explode it did, time and time again. Stories of riots, assassinations, and orchestrated chaos flowed out of Pelican Bay like smoke through cracks in a wall. But the truth of how deep the corruption went, and how far the gangs reached, was something no one outside those walls ever fully saw. In 2011, a group of inmates in the SHU organized something no one expected. A hunger strike. It began with a few dozen men refusing meals. Within weeks, it spread across California prisons, with thousands refusing to eat in protest of indefinite solitary confinement. For the first time in decades, the shot callers weren't sending out orders of violence. They were sending out orders of silence. But silence in Pelican Bay is never peace. Because behind those concrete walls, behind the hunger strike, behind the isolation cells, investigators discovered something else. A network. Hidden ledgers. Coded lists. Plans that reached far beyond Crescent City. Plans that suggested Pelican Bay wasn't just America's most secure prison. It was also one of its most dangerous. The hunger strike. The summer of 2011 was unlike anything California's prison system had ever seen. It didn't begin with blood. It didn't begin with riots. It began with silence. In the SHU, dozens of men pushed away their meal trays. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Day after day they refused to eat. Their demand was simple but staggering. End indefinite solitary confinement. The organizers. At the heart of it were the very men the SHU was built to control, the shot callers. Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family. For decades they had ordered violence against each other. But now they united for something else. An inmate's declaration, smuggled out of Pelican Bay, read, "We are men. We are not animals. Indefinite isolation is a slow death. We will starve before we accept it." The message spread like wildfire. The spread. By the second week, the strike reached other prisons. San Quentin, Corcoran, Folsom. At its peak, over 30,000 inmates across California refused meals. For prison officials, it was a nightmare. Not because of violence, but because of unity. Men who were sworn enemies were now allies. Blood rivals set aside decades of hatred for a single purpose. The gangs that had made Pelican Bay a powder keg had turned it into a platform. The outside world. The hunger strike caught the attention of journalists, activists, and families of inmates. For years, Pelican Bay had been a shadow, its stories whispered, its violence ignored. But images of emaciated prisoners, of letters describing hallucinations and organ failure, forced the public to look. Protests erupted outside the gates. Signs read, "Stop solitary torture," and "Human rights for all." For the first time, Pelican Bay wasn't hidden in fog. It was exposed in daylight. The government response. Sacramento scrambled. Officials insisted solitary confinement was necessary to control gangs. Without it, they argued, California's prisons would collapse into chaos. But behind closed doors, reports leaked of inmates held in isolation for decades. Some had been in the SHU since the early 1990s, without ever being convicted of a new crime inside. And many were there not for violence, but for association. Tattoos. Possessing gang-related art. Even reading certain books. The hunger strike forced the system to admit what inmates had always known. The SHU wasn't just about punishment. It was about power. By late summer, after weeks of refusing food, inmates were collapsing. Some were near death. The state finally agreed to negotiations. Small concessions were made. Better food. Access to calendars. Some ability to make phone calls. But the bigger fight, ending indefinite solitary, wasn't over. And inside the SHU, investigators discovered that while the hunger strike united the gangs in protest, it also masked something darker. Because while the world focused on starvation, the shot callers never stopped running business. Hidden in the silence, they were still sending orders. Orders for something bigger. The codes of power. When the hunger strike ended, attention faded. Reporters left. Protests dwindled. The public believed the crisis was over. But inside Pelican Bay, nothing had changed. The SHU still stood. The gangs still ruled. And the hunger strike had done something unexpected. It showed the shot callers how powerful unity could be. The ledgers. In 2012, during a routine cell search, investigators discovered a hidden notebook. It wasn't filled with protest demands. It was filled with coded financial records, drug shipments, street collections, names of men on the outside sending money orders, even lawyers acting as couriers. The handwriting was meticulous, the codes intricate. But the meaning was clear. Pelican Bay wasn't just housing criminals. It was headquarters. One officer later said, "It was like opening the books of a corporation." Pelican Bay was the boardroom, and the SHU was the CEO's office. The codes. Deciphering the notebook revealed something chilling. Messages disguised as chess moves. Orders buried in Bible verses. A single word written in tiny print that meant, kill. Every page was proof that the SHU wasn't silencing gangs, it was protecting them. From those cells, the shot callers controlled drug pipelines stretching from California to Mexico. They ordered assaults on rival gangs in Los Angeles. They even reached as far as Las Vegas, where casinos were laundering their money. The corruption. But the deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became. This power wasn't possible without help. Guards had smuggled in contraband. Lawyers had carried coded notes. Even male inspectors had looked the other way. And the more they uncovered, the more they realized Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison with gangs. It was a partnership. The turning point. In 2013, another hunger strike began, bigger than the first. Once again, tens of thousands joined across California. But this time, the state had learned its lesson. They cracked down harder, faster, cutting communication, isolating leaders even further. But the codes kept flowing. Even when inmates starved, the power of the SHU never weakened. One investigator, reviewing coded ledgers late one night, froze when he deciphered a phrase. Phase 3, outside targets. For years, Pelican Bay had been a fortress where violence stayed inside the walls. Now the code suggested something new. The prison's reach was stretching outward. And the next move wouldn't be behind bars. Beyond the walls. The phrase stopped investigators cold. Phase 3, outside targets. Written in coded shorthand across the pages of a ledger smuggled out of the SHU, the message meant one thing: Pelican Bay's power wasn't confined anymore. Orders were leaving the prison. The outside world was in play. The first signs. At first it seemed like coincidence. A series of assaults in Los Angeles, carried out with eerie precision. A drug courier in Oakland killed execution style. A corrections officer in Fresno found beaten outside his home. Different cities. Different victims. No clear connection. But when detectives traced the timelines, they noticed a chilling pattern. Each event occurred within weeks of coded messages deciphered from Pelican Bay. What investigators once thought of as random street crime was now being tied back to the prison's most isolated unit. The SHU wasn't breaking gangs apart. It was helping them coordinate. The invisible hand. To the public, Pelican Bay looked impenetrable. Guards with rifles in every tower, cameras watching every corridor, steel doors clanging shut at every turn. But to the men inside, it was simply a fortress to be operated from. They had learned to weaponize silence. One tiny scrap of paper, slipped past mail inspectors, disguised in legal documents, could order a hit hundreds of miles away. A single coded phone call, disguised as a message to family, could greenlight a shipment of drugs. The invisible hand of Pelican Bay reached farther than anyone imagined. The case of Officer Ramirez. In 2014, investigators got their clearest proof yet. Correctional Officer Luis Ramirez was found shot in his driveway in Sacramento. At first, police suspected robbery. But nothing was taken. His wallet and badge were still in his pocket. Weeks later, detectives uncovered evidence tying Ramirez to a smuggling ring inside Pelican Bay. He had been moving contraband, phones, tobacco, even drugs, in exchange for cash. When the gang leaders in the SHU discovered he was skimming profits, they sent a message. Not to him. To the outside world. His execution wasn't punishment. It was a warning. No one, not even guards, could betray the system. And the order? It had been written months earlier in one of the ledgers seized from Pelican Bay. The politician. The reach didn't stop at guards. In 2015, whispers began about a local politician with suspicious ties to campaign donations. Investigators discovered thousands of dollars funneled into his fund from shell companies linked to prison gangs. The money trail traced back, once again, to Pelican Bay. The SHU had become more than a cell block. It was an office where leaders laundered money, influenced elections, and reminded California that even behind concrete, they weren't powerless. The breaking point. Detective Raymond Danner, who had tracked Pelican Bay's violence for decades, described it best. You lock men away for life, you think you've buried them. But you've only given them time. Time to think, time to plan, time to build something bigger. Pelican Bay didn't kill gangs. It made them more dangerous. The realization was staggering. The most secure prison in America had become the headquarters for a criminal empire stretching across state lines. The public ignorance. But outside Crescent City, most of the public never knew. News reports spoke of isolated incidents. Politicians praised reforms. The hunger strikes were portrayed as victories for human rights. The truth, that Pelican Bay's walls couldn't contain the violence, was buried under bureaucracy and silence. The state didn't want to admit its billion-dollar fortress had failed. That admitting it would mean admitting gangs had outsmarted the very system meant to crush them. The whistleblower. In 2016, a former guard came forward. His name was kept secret, his face blurred in interviews. But his words shook the foundation of Pelican Bay's myth. He revealed that certain officers, frustrated with low pay and dangerous conditions, had made deals with inmates. Some turned a blind eye to smuggling. Others actively helped. It wasn't just one bad apple, he said. It was a system. If you didn't play along, you didn't last. Everyone knew. Some of us kept quiet to stay alive. The whistleblower's testimony confirmed what investigators already suspected. Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison. It was a marketplace. And the currency wasn't just drugs or cash. It was influence. Beyond California. By 2017, evidence surfaced of Pelican Bay's influence reaching beyond California. A murder in Nevada. A drug bust in Arizona. Even a case in Mexico linked to cartel shipments traced back to orders from Crescent City. The fortress had become a hub. A quiet, hidden nerve center pulsing with commands that crossed borders. And all the while, the men inside sat in silence, their faces unseen, their voices unheard, yet their power undeniable. Investigators thought they had reached the peak. that they had uncovered the full scope of Pelican Bay's influence. But then came a chilling discovery. In a coded letter intercepted from the SHU, one line stood out. "The walls are not the limit. The system is ours." It wasn't just about gangs anymore. It was about control of the prison system itself. The system's secret. The phrase lingered like smoke. "The walls are not the limit. The system is ours." Investigators had always believed Pelican Bay's power ended at the fences. That gangs smuggled drugs, ordered hits, and influenced crime outside. But the words scrawled in that letter suggested something darker. The gangs weren't just operating inside Pelican Bay. They were embedded in the entire prison system. The final ledger. In 2018, during a sweep of the SHU, officers uncovered a hidden stash. Behind a loose brick in a cell wall, they found a ledger thicker than any before. At first glance, it was the usual: coded notes, financial records, names and numbers. But then investigators realized something chilling. Many of the names weren't inmates. They were guards, wardens, politicians. Dozens of corrections officers across California listed with $signs next to their names. Legislators tagged with coded initials. Even a state contractor responsible for supplying food to prisons was noted with the word secured. The ledger wasn't just a record of money. It was a blueprint for influence, the roots of control. For years, the SHU had been described as the end of the line. But the ledger revealed it was the center of the web. Every riot, every hunger strike, every policy debate had been influenced, manipulated, or exploited by the gangs inside. When inmates starved, the system gave them concessions that quietly strengthened their control. When riots broke out, politicians secured more funding for security, funding that expanded Pelican Bay's reach. The cycle fed itself. Pelican Bay wasn't failing. It was working exactly as intended, as a machine that justified its own existence, fueled by violence it helped create. The informant. One man finally broke the silence. In 2019, an inmate turned informant agreed to testify in exchange for protection. He was no ordinary prisoner. He had been a lieutenant to one of the shot callers for over a decade. He described how messages flowed out of the SHU. How lawyers, guards, even priests unknowingly carried coded slips of paper. How the gangs inside could decide who lived and who died on the streets of Los Angeles without leaving their cells. But his most chilling claim was this: "You think Pelican Bay belongs to the state? It doesn't. It belongs to us. Always has." The politicians fall. That same year, a California state senator was indicted on charges of accepting bribes. The money trail led back to businesses linked to prison gangs. The scandal shocked the public. But to investigators, it was just confirmation. Pelican Bay's influence wasn't an accident. It was strategy. From Crescent City, shot callers in windowless cells had reached the halls of Sacramento. The system wasn't just compromised. It was corrupted from within. Detective Danner's discovery. For Detective Raymond Danner, who had spent his career tracking Pelican Bay's bloody legacy, the ledger was the final piece of the puzzle. All the riots, all the murders, all the whispers of corruption, they weren't separate events. They were chapters in a larger story. A story of how America's most secure prison became its most dangerous boardroom. Danner retired in 2020. But in his final interview, he left a warning. Pelican Bay isn't just a prison. It's a reminder. You can build the highest walls, lock the heaviest doors, bury men in silence for decades, and they will still find a way to rule. The question isn't whether we control them. The question is whether they control us. The human cost. For the men inside, Pelican Bay remains a place of shadows. Some live their entire lives in solitary, never seeing the sun except through mesh. Others die quietly, their names forgotten, their stories buried. But for every man broken, another is hardened. For every silence forced, another whisper slips through the cracks. And outside, families wait. Mothers, wives, children, all tied to the prison by invisible strings of violence, fear, and hope. The shocking revelation. In 2021, a Freedom of Information request forced the state to release thousands of documents about Pelican Bay. Buried within them was a memo written years earlier, marked confidential. It described a program known only as integration. The program's goal was to use the SHU to control gangs by giving their leaders limited influence in exchange for cooperation. In other words, the state had struck deals. They had allowed shot callers to maintain power, to run their networks as long as they kept the prison from burning down. The hunger strikes, the riots, the corruption. None of it was just failure. It was policy. The last twist. The most secure prison in America wasn't built to destroy gangs. It was built to manage them. Pelican Bay wasn't a fortress of fear by accident. It was a calculated experiment, one that blurred the line between control and collaboration. And the haunting truth? The experiment worked. The SHU didn't just cage leaders. It turned them into partners. Partners whose power reached beyond the walls into cities, politics, and lives across California. The haunting ending. Today, Pelican Bay still stands, its gray walls rising against the mist. The SHU still buries men in silence. And the state still insists it's necessary for safety. But the ledgers, the testimony, the memos, they tell a different story. Pelican Bay isn't just America's most secure prison. It is America's most dangerous secret. And as long as the lights flicker in those windowless cells, as long as men whisper through vents and tap messages through pipes, the question will remain. Who really runs Pelican Bay? The guards? The gangs? Or the system itself? If this story left you shaken, subscribe now. Because the next prison we expose may be even darker.